Ahoy! This weekend I played 20 games of Gilgamesh. Why did I do that? Because I wanted to find out how this character really performs. So I spent all weekend playing Gilgamesh on PTS. And I'm really excited to talk about him because I think he is somewhat of an unusual god. Tiamat was kind of hard to judge in her balance because her kit is relatively complex, but at least at first glance that is not the case for Gilgamesh. And I think it's very interesting how he performed in other people's hands as well. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit first and then about my own experience. I had a look at some other streamers, some pro players and so on playing Gilgamesh. And obviously if you look on YouTube, they will usually upload the games that are stomps, where they look particularly good on the new god, and that is kind of consistent with what I found. If you look on Twitch, the situation is a little bit different. There were actually quite a few games where he did not perform particularly well and where even the pro players were struggling a little bit on him. This especially happened if they fell behind an early game. At the same time, what was consistent was when they got ahead, they usually snowballed a lot with that. Now you can kind of somewhat pin this on them being pro players who just know how to utilize elite better and who just play very well against an uncoordinated team, but I think there is more to it. My own experience was similarly tainted in some way because I was playing on 200 ping, and obviously a lot of matches ended up being unbalanced as well, and in some matches the enemy team decided to focus me very hard. Now this is all not unusual, but in the case of Gilgamesh, this makes a few more differences. And I think that's something worth digging into, and that brings us to his overall performance and why I think he is simultaneously a very strong character, but also not a strong character. And if that doesn't make sense to you now, it hopefully will after we go through his different aspects. Let's first look at some overarching points. One thing that stands out is that Gilgamesh doesn't have any CC immunity. We have a few gods like that, but it's not that common, and it is something worth pointing out. He doesn't even get any sort of immunities in his 2, we'll get to that a little bit later. Additionally, he is the only warrior that doesn't have a direct self-heal, a defense or mitigation increase, or some form of shield. Literally every other warrior has at least one of these things. I thought there were a few that maybe don't, like King Arthur or Bellona, but they all have some sort of defense increase, some sort of mitigation increase that make them just a little bit more tanky. He has none of that. That overall makes him a relatively weak frontliner. He doesn't have the same sustain or damage absorption that other solo laners provide if you play them in frontline, which is very interesting. He also has relatively limited mobility. He has a leap in his 3, and he has a very short dash in his 2, and that's it. And since the 3 is designed in a way where it provides your team with buffs, you often want to use it to engage, so if you do that, you don't have any mobility anymore. Other solo laners are more okay with that because they still have their shields and their sustain. He doesn't have that. At the same time, he still has good engage potential. You can use your ult to slow the enemies, and you can put that in front of you, it's not around you, so you can slow enemies at a distance. You can use your 3 to engage, and sometimes maybe even the mobility from the 2 if necessary. But it does feel like he utilizes Blink very well, similar to maybe a Tyr, which I would generally say is in some way similar to Gilgamesh, when you utilize his 2 right after a Blink to kick an enemy back into your team. So I often felt that that was still very useful for setups. Otherwise, he also greatly benefits from movement speed that allows him to walk past an enemy or next to an enemy and position himself better in order to get a better kick off onto them to kick them into a wall or back into your team. That's why items like Talisman of Energy are, in my opinion, very strong on him. It also helps when you're not a solo laner here, if you're playing with a jungler, because then you get much better angles where you can just come in from the side if you're not required to frontline. At the same time, if he gets Blink, that prevents him from using his 3 to engage, which is also a downside because the 3 is huge team utility, providing your team with 25 to 35% movement speed and some lifesteal, which I think is a little bit more gimmicky and better for clickbait because it doesn't really affect you all that often unless the enemy fights in the flag. But all of that combined, in my opinion, leads to this character being extremely snowbally. If you're in a position where you're tanky enough and have high enough damage to just hard engage on the enemy and kick them back into your team without worrying about your escape, you're stomping. You can frag through the enemy team so easily, and he has very high damage numbers to support that. We'll look into those a little bit later. But at the same time, if you're not quite that ahead, then things get a little bit more risky very quickly. If you don't have the survivability and the mobility that other solo laners have, it can often put you in a very bad spot, and your self-peel in those moments is mostly limited to your 2 and a little bit to your ultimate. What's also very important with Gilgamesh is that a lot of his potential hinges on his ultimate, and his ultimate relies on the enemy being slowable and being knocked back. A lot of gods actually have ways to prevent that. Aside of just going Winged Blade, you can use gods like Baba Yaga, Vamana, Jörmungandr, Fenrir, Cthulhu, Xingtian that all immune his ultimate in one way or another. And even an enemy just quickly walking out before you can fully close the distance happens more often than you would think. That's not to mention that the ultimate is also countered by beats, by Aegis, by Shell upgraded. Once you get to the absorb point, it will no longer pull enemies, and many other items in one way or another that make it so that it's very, very hard to actually lock an enemy in his ultimate. So if you only play around the ultimate and the enemy team comp is just built against you a little bit, then you're already setting yourself up for trouble. And I found that depending on the matchup, his performance would drastically differ. What I also learned in the process is that while his skill floor is low and this kit is very simple in itself, his skill ceiling is all but low. Really utilizing his kit correctly and effectively requires a lot more experience that one would initially expect, and I do think a lot of people will play him and maybe not stomp in their first game because they're unlucky with that, and then just drop him because they think he doesn't feel good to them. Let's talk a little bit about the individual abilities. The passive is weird. You basically depend on double, if not triple luck. The first part being that the item spawn when you hit level 5 can happen in a relatively random area. It can actually happen really close to you, or it can happen quite far away. And depending on where it happens, it may mean that you actually have to sacrifice yourself to even get your item, whereas in other situations, you get your item immediately and for free. And I don't think that feels fair so far. Likewise, the RNG with the item itself. If you get an item that specifically counters your enemy solo laner matchup, for example, that's excellent. But you might also get an item like the Mask, which is completely useless for you in that situation, gives you minimal base stats, or a tier 1 crit item that you're not going to build into, and then suddenly your whole matchup feels a lot worse. The second item requires you to participate in at least 3 kills and assists in a relatively short amount of time, which again is kind of R&D because it just depends on how well your team is doing overall. And if you have a well-performing team, you might get an extra item very early, and if you have a poorly performing team, you might get it very late. And again, the item that you get from that is something you cannot control. Most of the time, I ended up just selling whatever I got and using it to get a further upgrade on the item that I'm already building into. Having this passive also obviously hurts his late game because he doesn't really have a passive in late game anymore. He got some extra gold and that's it. I don't think it's necessarily bad, it just designs him more towards earlier stages of the game, but it does feel bad in times at late game. His first ability, Sunforged Scimitar, in my opinion, feels like the most balanced part of his kit. It deals initial AoE circle damage, it's a slow afterwards, and then you get a basic attack steroid, and it is on a very short cooldown once you mech the ability. This is nice for solo. I think this might actually be an interesting thing to upgrade in solo just because of the shorter cooldown. It is nice in jungle as well. It is very item dependent obviously because you want to have attack speed with it, you want to have health with it in order to use it effectively. Again, Talisman of Energy is huge in that regard. But overall I don't really have any complaints with the ability and I don't think it needs any major changes. The second ability is the Problem Child. Dropkick is a really cool ability because you can kick an enemy to the wall and you can stun them. The problem is how it interacts with other abilities. I had consistent issues where the enemy should have been hit and didn't get hit. I don't know how much of that was down to ping, but I'm pretty sure there are some weird ability interactions where it doesn't actually confirm when it should. But worse than that, this ability doesn't actually count as what it is. It is technically a very short dash, it actually brings you forward a little bit, but it doesn't count as a dash. So it is, for example, not countered by cripples. Which I guess could be fair enough, maybe the dash distance here is just not long enough to justify that. But at the same time, it is also not provided with the usual immunities that you would get on an ability with a wind-up. Usually you'd expect a knock-up, knock-back immunity or something on it in order to be able to actually get it through because it's such a substantial CC for him. And that is not the case either, which means if you're going for this in a team fight, you will often end up in situations where this gets interrupted over and over without you actually getting it through once, and it feels really, really frustrating. Obviously, this is one of these abilities where you can end up helping your team or helping the enemy team, depending on how you kick an enemy, because the initial damage of the ability is actually relatively low. And what's also interesting is if you kick a God into the tornado, like into your ultimate, it actually deals only the bonus damage and not the burst damage, which is the much higher damage. And the burst damage is what you want. You want to kick them into a wall to get that extra damage. And obviously, there aren't always walls around, and especially in non-conquest modes, and this is going to be really rough for him. In Arena, this is not going to be fun for him at all, I think. If you kick an enemy into your team, you also rely on your team to follow up, which can be good in some situations, but can also lead to you kind of standing in the enemy team on your own while they don't follow up. His third ability is an interesting one, which I think is not actually problematic. Yeah, it can provide an insane amount of lifesteal, but it's in a very small area, and if the enemy chooses to box in this very obvious flag, that's kind of on them. And the movement speed buff here is huge as well, obviously, but it also sacrifices your only escape. A major downside of this ability is the visual similarity to the ultimate, which makes it very messy to see what's going on, in my opinion, because they're both these yellow AoEs. The ult is also a little bit weird. It has some interesting mechanics, but sometimes doesn't seem to work as intended. Sometimes the pull detection doesn't seem to work. Again, could be a ping issue primarily, but it was very frustrating when you hit an enemy right at the edge and they don't get pulled in. As I already said, it gets countered by almost everything, including pretty much every escape and everything else that can kind of get you out of that with some form of immunity, which again limits its usage against any Sicilian guard. What I would find very useful for this ability, which kind of annoyed me that it doesn't have it, is an actual indicator where the pull zone of the ability is active. As it stands, it seems to be just a guessing game, and if you hit an enemy just a little bit too early, you may end up not pulling them, and the next basic is too late to get them. And likewise, I think enemies should be able to know when they get pulled as well in what area, so I think that should be added. Now, what I thought would be important to understand with Gilgamesh is his damage output as well. Because if you look at his raw numbers, they actually look pretty insane, and it is worth pointing out that usually you will not be able to get all of those numbers in a combo. And to make you understand that, I'm gonna give you a few examples. This here is the total damage of Raven's abilities, 1280 and 320% scaling if you just drop your entire kit into an enemy. Very straightforward guard with very simple damage. And these here are Gilgamesh numbers. You can see that if you do the combo in the ultimate, with the 1, 2 and 3 all being used in the ultimate, you can deal 1808 damage with 365 scaling, which is more than Raven. But if you do the combo against a wall, so you just kick an enemy into a wall, and you use the first part of the ult, but the enemy actually doesn't stay for the whole duration, which they usually don't, then you do 1355 damage with 315% scaling, which is roughly the same as Raven's damage, slightly more. If, however, you do all your abilities without knocking an enemy into a wall at all, or without knocking them into your ult, which again could happen quite frequently if you kick them into your team, then you only do 1105 damage, as well as 250% scaling. So his damage can go down quite a lot if you're not using your combo as effectively as possible, which often you will not, especially as a new player. So his damage numbers are very hypothetical, and then beyond that they also depend on your build, if you're building more into basic attacks or building more into abilities, since he can do either, or he can go fully tanky, and that makes for some very interesting outcomes. My experience so far, obviously with a certain bias, but has been that he actually feels better in jungle because it allows him to opt more into damaging items, opt more into whatever the game needs, utilize the free items more and have an easier time getting to the free items, while also being able to play more of that backline engage rather than being a frontliner as you would expect from most solo laners and not needing some tanky character somewhere else or purely relying on the support. If you play him in solo and your support relies on slows primarily, or your support doesn't have the best frontline CC and setup, then you're kind of done for in my opinion, since Gilgamesh can't provide that. I feel like he's much better at singling out a target and making his combo work on them and zoning the rest off with his ultimate area a little bit. So I found that that is easier to execute in jungle, but again, there's a certain bias on my end here as well. But what I did find in general is that he does relatively poorly from behind. He doesn't have the highest damage output unless you fully execute the combo properly, whereas on the flip side, if you do the combo well, you can just burn through an enemy without them even knowing what's happening, and you can utilize Snowball very well to play very aggressively into the enemy team and make short work of them. His learning curve is significantly higher than most of the characters, especially when it comes to utilizing his ult properly, even though his kit may not seem like that at first. I think it's kind of like learning to play Tyr once again, or maybe Hercules, only that some abilities also work differently and he's more AA focused. But what that opens up for him is also a very flexible build path. You can go AA focused, ability focused, tanky, it all works out. I think usually a bruiser mix is probably best because he can soak up some damage that way while still getting his kit off easily. I do expect him to release above the point of balance overall, and I think a lot of people will initially think that he's very OP if they face one and they don't know how to deal with him yet, but once they learn how to position against them and everything, his win rate might go down a little bit, though at the same time when people learn him, he might be a lot scarier again. But so far my impression has not really been that he's utterly broken, and I think especially in competitive, it will be a lot more about utilizing him in the right team comp, because he is super easy to counterpick and you can basically build a whole comp around negating his entire kit, and at that point he can't do much anymore, which is a very interesting situation for a god to be in. So this is my impression of Gilgamesh so far. Let's see how it changes once he hits the live client. Thank you guys very much for watching, hit like and subscribe or